We are fortunate and honored to have a lunch speaker today. Our speaker is going to be Lawrence J. Kotlikoff, who's a professor of economics at Boston University, an associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a fellow of the Econometric Society, and president of Economic Security Planning, Inc., which is a company specializing in financial planning. Professor Kotlikoff received his PhD in economics from Harvard University in 1977. From 77 to 83, he served on the faculties of economics at the University of California, Los Angeles, and Yale University. In 1981 and 82, Professor Kotlikoff was a senior economist with the President's Council on Economic Advisors. Professor Kotlikoff has served as a consultant to numerous multilateral institutions, including the World Bank and IMF, as well as a host of government agencies and numerous private companies. He's provided expert testimony on numerous occasions to the Senate Finance Committee, the House Ways and Means Committee, and the Joint Economic Committee. He's the author of 11 books, hundreds of professional journals, most recently author with Scott Burns of a book entitled The Coming Generational Storm. I know him best for his book with Alan Auerbach in 1987, which has been that's preceded most of my work. But anyways, we are honored to have Professor Kotlikoff give us a lunch address on the National Retail Sales Tax.
Thank you. It's great to be back at the Baker Institute and seeing lots of old and young friends. The last time I was here was about a decade ago, and it was for the same conference. It was a conference on tax reform. And at the time, I spoke about consumption taxation, saying that I thought it was really urgent that we move to consumption taxation. And here I am today going to say basically the same thing, but I think that it's actually a lot more urgent today than it was back then. Why do I say that? Well, our country's, I think, bankrupt at this point, fiscally speaking. And I'm not saying this with absolute certainty, and I hope I'm wrong. And there are scenarios under which we can outgrow our mess if we could somehow get control of our spending and continue to grow, that we might be able to get this under control at some point. But if you look at the fiscal gap that we're facing, if you look at the numbers that Jagdish Gokhale and Ken Smetters have put together most recently, they're showing a $63 trillion gap separating the present value of all the government's projected expenditures and the present value of all its projected receipts. And the expenditures here include servicing the debt, as well as paying for the discretionary spending and all the transfer payments that you know are in the medical area, of course, are growing at leaps and bounds. I think their estimate, or I've seen estimates that the Part D Medicare expenditures by themselves present value to some $10, $15 trillion. So how are we going to pay for all this? You know, we've got this very aging society. The oldest baby boomer today is age 60, just 2 years away from collecting Social Security. The magnitude of the aging, in some ways, is quite startling. In my book with Scott Burns, we pointed out that, and I think this is right, Scott came up with this, I hope it's right, I never really triple checked, but we said that if you add together all the 85 people that are 85 and older in 2050, it's going to be enough people to fill up Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York City. And there'll be enough people 100 and over in 2050 to fill up Washington, D.C. It gives you some sense of just the number of very old people, and of course the very old people are very expensive when it comes to health care. So if you look at the fiscal gap study of Smetters and Gokhale, you conclude that there's a menu of pain, different things we could choose among to try and get rid of this $63 trillion fiscal gap. And one of these would be to have a 109% immediate and permanent hike in the payroll tax. That would generate $63 trillion in present value. Another thing we could do is have a 70% immediate hike and permanent hike in the personal income tax, federal personal income tax, and also the federal corporate income tax. That would also get us $63 trillion. None of those things are very nice to do. What about a 91% cut, immediate and permanent, in discretionary spending? So whatever we were projecting discretionary spending to be, let's cut it immediately and permanently by 91%. Cut the military 91%, cut the president's cigar budget 91%, cut all the salaries of Jane's salary by 91%. That's not going to go over. What about immediate and permanent 45% cut in Social Security and Medicare benefits? That would also do the trick. So that's why I say that the country seems to be bankrupt. You know, you can never tell when a company is bankrupt. It's always a judgment of when that is, value judgment, and I think that's the same thing here. So we need to do some significant things if we're going to save the country from what will happen if we continue down this path. Now, we also aren't sitting here with we have experienced tax cuts. There were 3 tax cuts in the first years of the Bush administration. And despite that, we still have very high marginal tax rates. In some work that David Rapson, my graduate student at Boston University, and I are doing right now, we're looking at not just federal marginal taxes, but state and federal marginal taxes, and not just marginal taxes coming from the tax side, but also marginal taxation from the benefit side, you know, from things like the food stamp program, or the transitional family aid to families with dependent children, or the WIC program, or other welfare programs, as well as Social Security from their benefit provisions. So what you find is that basically all American workers are in the 35 to 45% tax bracket. Some are in somewhat higher, some are a little bit lower, but the vast majority of American workers are being taxed at the margin on an additional hour of work in that range, 35 to 45%. And then the vast majority of Americans are facing marginal taxes on saving that range from 20 to 50%. And by that I mean if they reduce their consumption by, let's say, $1,000 or $100 today and spend it evenly in the future, the present value of the increase in their spending would be 80 cents on the dollar to 50 cents on the dollar, so that they would get back in present value somewhere between 80 and 50 cents in engaging in that move. That's what it would cost. They give up a dollar today and they only get back in present value 50 to 80 cents. Now, so we have a pretty distorted tax system, and we also have the prospects of much higher marginal rates, because when whatever it is hits the fan, taxes are going to have to go up, and benefits are going to be cut, and there's probably going to be more means testing of benefits, and marginal rates are going to be that much higher. So what should we be thinking about doing here? Well, we should probably find the next page of my little talk, which I seem to have lost. Well, let me just say that when you think about the where we're at, you kind of think of it as being a situation that's not conservative or secure, and you think that what we're really in is in a policy that itself is radical. Having a policy path where you have these demographics coming, and you have the president cutting taxes 3 times dramatically, generating a much larger explicit debt, when you have the Medicare benefits and Medicaid benefits per beneficiary growing at 4.2 something like 4.6% per year in real terms for the last 32 years in a study that I recently completed. That's the benefit level. That's not the absolute benefit, it's just the benefit per recipient. And when you have, in response to those circumstances, the government expanding the Medicare system by putting this new drug benefit into place, when you have that happening, you think, geez, this is radical policy. This is not, stable status. You got to get to think that the status quo is A, not sustainable, and A, pretty crazy, and B, pretty crazy, and C, let's use the word radical. So I think that when we think about tax reform from this context, things that seem radical may actually not be radical. They may actually just be sensible or conservative. So the language labeling, let's say, a move to a consumption tax as radical in this context, even if we're talking about a dramatic change in the tax structure, let's say to a retail sales tax, I don't really view that as radical. I view that as sensible and conservative. Another way to think about this is that if you're driving in a car, it's speeding along and your brakes aren't working and you're heading over the cliff, is it radical to jump out of the car? No, it's absolutely the thing to do. It's the conservative, the sensible thing to do. And if you continue over the cliff, that's what's radical, and that's indeed suicidal. I think that our policy path is in some sense suicidal. I think that if we continue along it, we're going to have a financial meltdown to go along with the other things that are going to happen, tax hikes and benefit cuts. I can't, I've been claiming this for a while, and it hasn't happened, and I've been losing money on my short position on trying to short the U.S. Treasury bonds. So let's hope that I'm wrong. But I think from a present value perspective, the U.S. is in probably worse fiscal shape than any country in the world, including Japan, because of the benefit growth rate of the healthcare and the fact that we have no clear idea how to restrain that. Now, a consumption tax that I've been advocating would deliver some real benefits. I think we need to use a consumption tax to get higher revenues than we are getting, but even more importantly, to restrain the growth in spending. I think we need to think about using consumption taxation, in particular the retail sales tax, the FairTax, which I'm going to talk about in more detail, to try and use that as a way to budget us going forward. And I'll come back to that. But why, in general, do I favor consumption taxation over, let's say, having a cleaner income tax or just have a wage tax? Well, it does kind of go back to my earlier work with Alan, where we looked at the issues of efficiency and growth. We found that a consumption tax, because it did have this lump sum tax feature in taxing the wealth of primarily the elderly, because when you take your wealth and you go spend it, you end up paying a tax. Or if you implement a consumption tax through a VAT or a flat tax, you reduce the value of the wealth at the market in terms of its market price. And you, in effect, have a combination of a wealth tax and a wage tax, a one-time wealth tax. And that one-time wealth tax allows you to have some efficiency gains, and also getting rid of the taxation of saving at the margin provides some efficiency gains. And then there's the prospect of lowering the marginal rates on workers, because you're getting more resources, more revenues from the elderly in switching to a consumption tax, so you can have lower rates of marginal taxation of the labor supply of young and future workers. So all this stuff together delivers some potential efficiency gains. And then there's also the growth implications, the fact that you can make future generations better off, because when you have this transition to a consumption tax, you put a damper on consumption, particularly of the older generations, and that allows the economy to consume less and to save more. You realize, of course, that the national saving rate right now is 2.1%. That's incredibly low compared to where it was in the 50s and 60s when it was around 12, 13%. And it's steadily gone down, and I'm pretty well convinced, based on research I've done with John Sablehouse and Jagdish Gokhale, that decline in national saving is not really due to bad incentives to save, not really the substitution effects, but really the income effects, the fact that we're taking ever larger sums from young people who are savers according to the life cycle model and giving those resources to older people who are spenders according to the life cycle model. They have the high propensities to consume. And we're, of course, giving these resources to the elderly in forms that they can only consume to a large extent. If you think about Medicare and Medicaid benefits, that's pure consumption, and you really can't save a heart transplant. Now, so we need to get to a higher saving rate. Right now, foreigners are investing $4 for every dollar that Americans are investing in the U.S. because our saving rate is so low. That's what our current account deficit amounts to when you look at it. So getting growth, getting more saving through a consumption tax is very useful, getting efficiency improvements. I think a consumption tax, if it's implemented as a retail sales tax, will provide transparency that we don't have in a system that's incredibly complicated and that we wouldn't have with a VAT or flat tax. We wouldn't have as transparent a tax system as we would have under a retail sales tax. And what about equity? Well, we have a system that's, got some elements of progressivity and it's got some elements of regressivity. We've got the elderly who've got a lot of wealth are facing these very low taxes on their capital income, 15% dividend taxes, 15% capital gain tax rates. I'm not saying that's the effective rate on capital gains because obviously inflation is not properly accounted for on capital gains taxation. But where there has been a movement away from taxing the elderly toward putting more of a burden, more of a share of the burden onto the young. And so in terms of equity, generational equity, I think we've been moving in the wrong direction. A consumption tax would move us toward more generational equity. What about intergenerational equity? Well, we have provisions in the current tax system, such as the payroll tax, which is highly regressive, which would would be eliminated in going to the FairTax, and also taxing wealth in effect through the FairTax seems to be a pretty progressive thing. And then the FairTax, as I'm sure you're all aware, is talking about implementing a consumption tax at a 23% effective rate, a 30% tax exclusive rate, plus having a rebate which would insulate anybody who is truly poor from paying any taxes on net. This rebate would be basically a demo grant that's based on your family size, independent of your income. Everybody would get it. It would be highly progressive. So we're talking about, with respect to the FairTax, going from what we now have to a system with no payroll tax, a wealth tax, and in effect a wealth tax, and also a progressive rebate. If you like, a new entitlement program that's highly progressive. So if I were to come to a group of Democrats and say, gee, I'd like to have, and also a lower wage tax. You got to realize that the effective wage tax under the FairTax is lower. So if I went to a convention of Democrats, I said, you know what, we've got a pretty regressive system here, and they would nod their head. And I say, what we need to do is tax wealth. We need to get rid of the payroll tax. We need to lower the taxes on workers, and we need to have a new progressive entitlement program that gives everybody the same amount of money, independent, just based on their family size, independent of their income. Everybody would applaud. If I were to say to that same audience, if I hadn't said that, but I said, I want to talk to you about having a federal retail sales tax with a rebate, they would start booing. And indeed, I have said exactly the second thing to a group of people, to a conference on tax reform that was at Harvard Law School. Peter Diamond and I were on the panel, and a lawyer for the for this union. It was kind of a union group, a group of union leaders got up and started calling me a liar when I said this thing has got these progressive elements. He actually got extremely upset, and he didn't physically attack me, but Peter had to come to my defense, which is not something Peter, not physically, but intellectually. I was trying to defend myself, and Peter, who was viewed as like the lefty, comes and starts saying, well, you got to listen to what this guy's saying. He's not saying complete nonsense. So this is highly emotional, and people aren't necessarily thinking about it carefully or correctly. So there is, I think, a kind of a sense among tax economists, among most of us here in the room, that consumption, if we're going to have tax reform, we should move in the direction of a consumption tax. And there's also a sense that I think that we want to make sure that we actually end up with a consumption tax, not a wage tax. Well, that depends critically on making sure that this wealth tax component is part of the transition to a consumption tax. Now, if you look at the VAT or a flat tax, these are theoretically consumption taxes, just being imposed different ways, of course, collected different ways. But when you ask the proponents of the VAT and the flat tax what they would do when it comes to transition rules, they'll tell you that they want to provide transition. They want to make sure that somebody who has an old piece of capital the day before the VAT or the flat tax or the cash flow tax in the case of the President's Panel Commission, the guy who bought that building, let's say the day before this type of tax is implemented and tries to sell it the next day, wouldn't get hit with the tax the next day, which is exactly what should happen. He should be really clobbered. That's really what the consumption tax does. It says from one day to the next, somebody who's wealthy, somebody like Leo Lindbeck, who's the big major proponent of the FairTax, the leader of the FairTax movement, should get zapped, because Leo, if he took his, the day after the FairTax was implemented, if it were implemented, he took all his wealth, he's got some wealth, and were to spend it, he would lose 23% of it. And the day before he wouldn't. So that's exactly what it's supposed to do. Now, Bob Hall, Rabushka, David Bradford, who's advocating the X tax, other people, I guess, Michael Gratz, who's advocating the value-added tax, who's at Yale. I think all these people would say we need to have transition relief. The tax panel said we need to have transition relief. Jim and Eddie, now they're not providing complete transition relief, to be fair, in the tax panel proposal, but they're providing significant transition relief. So that's what I'm concerned with. If we go to try and get to a consumption tax through that path, we're actually going to give up the game here. We're going to end up with primarily a wage tax, and therefore a bigger burden on younger people. And the efficiency gains from consumption taxation are going to go bye-bye, because the consumption tax efficiency gains are from the lump sum tax. And yeah, there's a question of whether if you have lump sum taxes too often, whether that becomes, in effect expected. But I think we could have a one-time wealth tax without it necessarily being that we, view that we're going to change taxes again in the future. But anyway, the efficiency gains come from that lump sum tax. And if you simulate going from an income tax to a consumption tax, you get the efficiency gains showing up in the simulation. But if you simulate going from an income tax to a wage tax, you get efficiency losses on balance. So the efficiency gains depend on doing it right. I don't think that we're going to do it right with a VAT or a cash flow tax or a flat tax. So that brings me to the fair tax. And the key concern about the fair tax is the tax rate and being able to collect the tax. And let me just talk about that for a little bit. The fair tax tax base is basically all of consumption with a couple exceptions. One is educational expenditure, which is of course good for us, but also owner-occupied housing. The imputed rent on owner-occupied housing, those are the two big exceptions. That's not included. And I personally would favor at least including owner-occupied housing in the tax base, but that's not the fair tax proposal at the moment. But the key thing about the fair tax, if you read line 1 of the tax bill, which is H.R. 25, after you go through some gobbledygook, but you get to the first piece of meat, is that the tax rate is 23% tax inclusive, and it's 30% tax exclusive. So that at the store you'd pay 30 cents, but in effect it's like a 23% equivalent income tax or wage tax or wealth tax, like losing 23% of those things. Now, according to Bill Gale's analysis of what the kind of tax base would be, he wrote an article in Tax Notes, and I used his tax base. It turns out that with a 23% tax rate, you actually get more revenue, real revenue, being generated by the fair tax than the existing system. You get a little bit more revenue from it. But the 23% rate can't support all existing real spending plus pay for the rebate. So there's a little catch there. And this rebate, again, is a big and highly progressive entitlement program, if you like. You can call it that. So to accommodate a 23% rate, you'd have to, plus the rebate, well, to accommodate, if you had a 23% rate and the rebate and you wanted to keep the real deficit no larger, you would need about a 20% cutback in non-Social Security federal expenditures. I say non-Social Security because H.R. 25 preserves real Social Security benefits as part of its provision. So this may sound like a big deal, 20% cutback in discretionary spending and other non-Social Security transfer payments, and you say, my God, that's not feasible. And by the way, this 20% cutback number is based on a careful study that was been done by David Turk and his colleagues at Suffolk University with a little bit of kibitzing from me, and they're using Bill Gale's methodology here. So it's not, Bill had the right basic framework for thinking about this. It's not any kind of fundamental question about how to think about this. So what do you think about a 20% cutback in these forms of spending? Well, if you're a Democrat, you should think that's not so bad, because that would bring you back to the ratio of that spending to GDP that we had in 2000 when Bill Clinton left office. So if you're a Democrat and you think that things were good for your point of view when Clinton was in office and we had the right kind of policy then gradually over time getting us down to to a reduction in this kind of spending to the same share of GDP that spending represented back in 2000 is something that you, I think, could accept. So I think that the fair tax is really, if you really think about it, or take the actual legislation that's been proposed seriously, it's really providing us a global budget. It's very transparent, focused on one particular number, 23%. And if we did adopt the fair tax, anybody who proposed additional spending would be telling the entire country that 23% rate is going to have to go up. So I think it provides us with a mechanism for getting control of the spending, which if we don't get control of, we're going to be bankrupt. I don't think we have any alternative but to get control of this spending. Now, what about the President's tax panel? Why did they reject the fair tax out of hand? And if it's more transparent, efficient, progressive, potentially has some very progressive elements, generationally more equitable, why did the tax panel reject it? Well, here's what I surmise from talking to some people on the panel and the staff and interacting with some people on the Treasury staff. And what I think is that the panel asked the Treasury staff, maybe Jim will correct me on this, to to try and cost out a retail sales tax. I'm not sure whether they were asked to cost out the FairTax per se, but they do. I think they do at least refer to the FairTax in the panel report. And I think the Treasury, and I may be wrong, but we have asked the Treasury 5 times to share its actual procedures, calculation procedures, with me, and 5 times they said they would next week. Hasn't arrived yet, but I'm sure it'll come sooner or later. But here's what I think happened. They looked at the distributional analysis based on the standard, very flawed, highly flawed method of looking at taxes divided by income. You and I don't believe that that's a reasonable way to assess progressivity. We think that lifetime resources is really the right measure, I think, of the right denominator for a tax fairness calculation, tax progressivity calculation. And from that perspective, a consumption tax without the rebate is proportional to lifetime resources if you're spending these resources over your lifetime, and even if you're leaving them to the next generation, to your kids, if you include that as part of your, when they spend the money that they inherit in present value, they're going to be paying the same tax as if you spent it before you died. So we start out thinking that a sales tax, retail sales tax, is proportional. You add in the rebate, you've got a progressive tax system. How is it that the Treasury decided it was highly regressive? Well, they divided income by, or taxes by income. And so having started there, I think, I don't know for sure, they decided, well, to make the thing progressive enough to satisfy, to be consistent with the existing tax system as with progressivity measured this way, we're going to have to reduce the tax base of the sales tax so as to exempt particular goods that the poor disproportionately consume. So then they start reducing the tax base, they end up with a very high tax rate, and then they say, well, gee, with this very high tax rate, we're going to have a lot more evasion than we might otherwise have had, so therefore we're going to make the tax rate even higher to deal with this higher evasion. And then, of course, they weren't kind of allowing themselves to think about cutting other kinds of spending in order to accommodate the rebate. So that leads to an even higher tax rate. So I don't know if this is the true story, and Jane's kind of shaking her head. I'm sure she'll correct me as she is wont to do, and usually for to good end. But this is my sense of how the Treasury came out with a conclusion that the tax rate, the fair tax rate, had to be wildly high, and that it was completely kind of infeasible. And I don't think that's the case. You know, if you do look at the David Turk study, based on Bill Gale's methodology, using NIPA, all the data is from NIPA, it's really reasonably done, carefully done, you see that a 23% rate will permit more real spending. But if you're going to introduce at the same time this new entitlement, very progressive, let's cut back some of the other spending. So we end up with something that looks like Bill Clinton left us with respect to that other spending. None of that is wacko. None of that's crazy. So I don't think that the fair tax is being portrayed by down in Washington as really wacky. You know, it's being promoted by a bunch of tax nuts. People want to get rid of the IRS, and a lot of these people, a lot of supporters do want to get rid of the IRS, and I think that's we're going to need somebody to enforce the fair tax. But I don't think that it's actually at all off the wall to think of this as. I don't think it's radical. Again, I think this is realistic. I think that continuing with what we've got is really radical and crazy. Now, this calculation that Turk and his colleagues did does not incorporate evasion. On the other hand, it doesn't incorporate the growth effects, the expansion of the tax base that would be arising from going to this more efficient and growth-oriented tax system. So I view those things as kind of basically offsetting, so that I think that the 20% cut in non-Social Security spending is reasonable. And by the way, just to be clear, you could I think, reasonably cut Social Security benefits, because this rebate is going to go to Social Security recipients as well as non-recipients. And if you preserve their real Social Security benefits and also give them the rebate, they're going to be made better off under the fair tax than they are under the existing system. So I think if you cut all spending, including Social Security, in the context of adding this rebate, you could end up with something more like a 15% across-the-board cut. So let me also, as I kind of come to a conclusion here, I kind of focus in on this issue of budget control, spending control. I think we do need to have a mechanism. The fact that we have all these different tax systems, explicit and implicit, alternative minimum tax, the regular tax, the corporate tax, the estate and gift tax. We have kind of implicit taxation through the welfare system. We have all this stuff going on, and nobody, when spending is being proposed, additional spending, nobody really understands that it's going to come back and bite them. Everybody thinks it's going to be the other person that's going to get hurt, so let's advocate more spending. Is the fair tax perfect? Well, again, I would include imputed housing, rental and housing. That would probably get the rate down from 23 to 20, or you could, another way of saying this is maybe you need more like a 10% across-the-board cut. What about tax evasion? How much evasion would there be with a 23% rate? Well, the vast majority of transactions is occurring at retail outlets. Walmart's is not going to be lying about its fair tax liability. Who's going to be lying about that will be the neighbor, you know, me and my lawnmower guy. My lawnmower guy, if I pay him in cash like I am now, he's not going to report it, and I'm probably not going to report it. So, well, what that tells you a little bit is that currently the NIPAs are probably underreporting consumption, so that this is in other words, it's not that if we were to have no evasion, we would have a bigger tax base to be kind of estimating this calculation off. So I guess I'm saying that the tax base that we're using here may be closer to what really is collectible, fully collectible, and that there's a lot of unreported consumption that may not end up being taxed, but that doesn't mean that the 23% rate calculation is wrong. The other thing to be said is that a lot of people think that the VAT is much more collectible. There's much less evasion relative to the retail sales tax. But to me, when I look at it, I mean, I'm not an expert on evasion, and I probably just thought about this incorrectly, and I've just done it in the last day or so. But it just seems to me that the incentive to evade at the margin, at that last stage of production, in the retail stage, under a value-added tax is exactly the same as under a retail sales tax. If you don't, you have your deductions from value-added tax, but if you don't report your sale proceeds, you get to save value-added tax on the entire sale proceeds, just like you would under retail sales tax. So I'm not sure that there's any real difference in incentives to evade. A lot of countries have the VAT and have been able to collect enough revenue to keep rolling. So what do I conclude here? I conclude that tax reform is not an option. I conclude that it's an imperative. I conclude that consumption taxation can deliver the goods in terms of efficiency, equity, growth, and transparency. I think that the fair tax, when you really think about implementation, is the only true consumption tax being proposed. So it's our only option. It's really our only option. And I conclude that a 23% rate should be viewed as a means of restoring fiscal discipline and keeping the fiscal system from driving our economy, ourselves, and our kids over the cliff. Thank you. And want me to take some? Okay.
So let's take some questions now, and then as well, if you agree, we'll just have a short question time now, and then can we have questions during the paper time as well on this? So this topic is also open to discussion when Larry presents his paper.
Yep.
Okay.
Kevin.
So you mentioned that it's been kind of like a public relations disaster, the FairTax, or that in Washington, it's been a public relations success outside of Washington, it seems to me, in the sense that
Yep.
had these best-selling books. So my question is that if everybody thinks it's kooky in Washington, then they probably think that under that null, because somebody said something to them that sounded reasonable, that was really damning, that they believe that's actually false. And so
Right.
what might that thing be?
I think the thing that was said that was damning, that was actually false, is that the tax rate had to be super high. I think that the people that evaluated the fair tax, including Bill Gale, didn't actually read what was actually being proposed. If you actually read H.R. 25, it says we're only going to really protect Social Security's real benefit levels. That's the only federal expenditure that's really protected by that piece of proposed legislation in terms of its real value. So I read that bill to say, okay, 23% is it. It's right there in line 1 of the bill. They're going to keep Social Security benefits fixed in real terms, but all the other spending in real terms is up for grabs to accommodate the rebate. So that's what I think was misleading. Yeah.
Just to understand, so Bill didn't think that there'd be any government spending reduction, and if you
Yes.
don't have that, then the rate has to be a lot higher, and you agree with his calculations?
Yeah, there's no, I mean, there's some differences, in exactly, some small differences in interpretation of the provisions, but the basic methodology that Bill's following is fine. There's nothing, it's correct. And there was some back and forth with some people. There's some question about whether the federal government, since it's going to have to pay the fair tax, and also state governments have to be compensated for having to pay the fair tax. That's incorporated in my saying that we need a 20% cut in this non-Social Security spending. That's all fully incorporated. Jimmy.
Let me just kind of rise to the bait for a moment.
Sure.
Be on the spot.
By the way, I love the tax panel. I gave the tax panel there's an op-ed coming out in the Economist Voice in which I give the tax panel a B+ for a very fine job, and I think Jim and Eddie did a fantastic job, and the report's marvelous, really. And I just spent the last semester teaching out of that book, really, literally. So I'm a big fan. That's a good grade. That's a really good grade for me.
I hope I'm still going to have that B+ when I finish speaking here.
Go ahead.
Let me say just a couple of things about the rate calculation, because I think it sort of clarifies where some of the issues with the report versus what you just described are. Before I do that, I just be clear that on all of the analytical principles that Larry has just laid out, I think there's complete agreement about the difference between, for example, wage taxation and consumption taxation, the importance of trying to get a tax burden on the existing asset holders. We may want to come back later to some of the political economy of how that's hard, and in fact, one of the reasons that the panel was uncomfortable recommending things that would have large takings from the existing asset holders was the sense that was an unfair way to proceed. But I think you and I share the sense that that's the way to get the maximum efficiency gain. Second, I think in terms of the arithmetic approach on all this, there is no disagreement. We're all within what you call the Bill Gale framework, and I think that's exactly right. And the Treasury was trying to implement that in the calculations they did for the panel, and the way you're describing it is within that framework as well. And third, I think your description of the proposal this afternoon is just crystal clear in terms of where all the important moving parts are. I think a lot of the discussion often doesn't recognize that there's an implicit change in the size of government here and other things along with that. But as you said, that's all very clearly there. Let me then turn to the rate calculation, because I just tried to make notes on, in some sense, what I think are the three key sources of the difference relative to what you described. If one goes to what I guess is chapter 9 in the panel report, where we reported some statistics on what the rates would be. The first thing is that we did not take the opportunity to cut spending by the 20% that you described. That immediately means you're going to come in with a higher rate,
Right.
Even done on the same methodology that you've just been describing. And the second thing is that there was always an assumption that there would be some evasion under the consumption tax, so that we wouldn't be able to tax the entire retail
Right.
base in what was out there. Now, I think the argument about retail sales tax versus a VAT, I went back at one point early in the panel deliberations to see what was written on Dosen in his work on this, there is not much point to higher compliance rates with a VAT versus a retail sales tax. So I think you're exactly consistent with the literature there. However, leaving aside this issue we raised today, which is maybe there's a bigger consumption base we don't see. If you think the consumption base is what's in the national accounts, and you're only going to be able to tax 85% of that or so, then then that necessarily forces you down to a somewhat lower base and pushes the rate up relative to what the calculation you described would look like. The final thing is this question about exclusions from the base, and there it's not a. I don't think this is a place where the arithmetic will come out different ways depending on what you put in. The panel basically said, look, if you compare retail sales taxes in the U.S. states, or you look at value-added taxes in other countries, we don't tax anything close to the entire amount of consumption with any of those taxes. So if you then apply a reduction factor based on saying you would do something similar if we put in place a retail sales tax at the federal level here, what you come up with is taking 30 or 40% of the sale of the consumption out of the base. And of course, once you do that, the rate's going to have to be significantly higher. And I should say, just as a final thought on all this, as we all know, once you sort of have taken the demographic, the giving people back this lump sum as a given, and then you start to hollow out the base of consumption in which you can levy your tax, the rate starts to rise quickly as you make the denominator smaller and smaller. And that's why when we combine that effect with the fact that I think the panel report most people, it discussed before the tax inclusive versus tax exclusive issue, which we all know will change the reported number, but nothing in terms of the underlying incentives here. But once you start to hollow out the base, and especially if you do it on a tax exclusive basis, so you're looking at T over 1 minus T in the calculations you're describing, as you start to make the T in your notation smaller, larger, T over 1 minus T rises very quickly. And that's the whole explanation of what the differences are, as best I can tell.
Yeah, I think, and that's, Jim, that's fully consistent. I think that's exactly what I said. But had the panel said, or had somebody down in Washington, was somebody saying that, gee, we could have a 23% rate with probably pretty small evasion because the rate's going to be low. We'll have to cut spending to something that most people wouldn't view as crazy. And we won't have to have a narrow base because we have this rebate that we're going to be introducing. That would have given a completely different spin on Washington's take on this at the moment. So I think both statements are right, except that one showed up in the report, unfortunately, not the other. There's how about another? Yeah.
Malcolm and Georgia.
Malcolm. Yeah.
Malcolm Gillis, I remember very well your plea for urgency 10 years ago.
I had more hair then, right?
Huh?
I had more hair.
Well, you did, and I had redder hair.
Redder hair, yeah.
But let me tell you something that you can use to add to your plea for urgency. As far as I know, there's no industrial nation in the world except Iceland, and that's only 600,000 people, who has ever breached the 5% barrier in the current account deficit as a percent of GDP. Well, we breached 6% in 2004 and 7% in 2005. Okay? Now, you can just, you alluded to the current account deficit, but this is a card you might want to play as you go around trying to talk about urgency.
Absolutely, yeah. It's huge.
Georgia. And
George.
Dan Shavir will be the last question.
Yeah, George.
Larry, maybe you could clarify something for me, or maybe Jim or Roseanne or one of the people involved in the panel. The panel looked at the FairTax bill specifically, and they came out with this estimate of 34% tax exclusion rate. Now, they based that on a couple of assumptions that I think are pretty unrealistic, but we can set those aside. That is, they assume a certain degree of compliance that I think is too high, and they also assume a base which is way too comprehensive. But let's set those aside because, after all, the FairTax bill has that base, and so let's assume the FairTax bill is the law.
Right.
The two aspects of it, though, that I don't understand is that estimate that the panel did was only in relation to replacing the income tax. That is,
Corporate,
they
yeah.
don't replace the payroll tax and the estate TFT
exactly, yeah.
And so, kind of, you know, a rough ballpark number in terms of how they relate to current law, you're talking about a tax that would have to raise revenues about 60% more in revenues just to pick up and pay for these additional items.
Right.
And then the last thing is, of course, the panel was computing a revenue estimate that is neutral relative to this totally, you know, fictional world of permanent tax cuts and Bush tax savings proposals and so forth. Which I assume the FairTax people aren't just assuming, but I don't know what the FairTax people do. In any event, when you put all that together, the 34% rate the panel estimates seems wildly low. That is the rate when you consider the additional taxes that we have to pay and the more natural looking. And so I just can't relate that at all to then the claim by FairTax that it's really 30%, even with the qualification that Jim just went through, where there is a difference in terms of the estimated government spending.
Well, when you well, as Jim says, it's extremely these tax rates are very sensitive to like how big the base is and whether you're in a how much evasion there's going to be. And you're absolutely right that the tax panel 34% rate doesn't include the payroll tax, and if you include that, they're up to maybe 45, 50%, huge numbers. And that's why the whole fair tax starts to sound ridiculous down in Washington, because that's the impression. But the same methodology, if you say we're going to absolutely stick to 23%, we're not going to narrow the base. Everybody's going to want to have a very broad base so that everybody can keep the rate down. All the public will want that. And we will have this rebate, and it will cut back the other spending. And yeah, there will be some evasion, but maybe it's going to be based on that kind of a lower rate. But then there's also growth effects. Well, I've spent several months looking at these calculations carefully, using this Gale methodology, and yeah, that's a 20% cutback in this other spending, and it's not a crazy cutback. We have cut back defense spending dramatically, discretionary spending as a share of GDP over the years, and we can cut back. And so the last part of your question was, well, we're in this, we've had these tax cuts, and we also have this projected deficit, kind of deficits off into the future, and aren't we going to really have to have higher tax rates to deal with this higher spending that's coming? And I'm starting out by saying that that spending is not affordable. If we go down that path of letting that spending happen, we're sunk under any tax system, certainly under the current tax system. We need to have the most efficient tax system we can have, the most equitable ones with the best work and saving incentives to deal with what's coming, to make this, to allow for the most possible spending. But we also need to have some fundamental budget control, some way to control the politicians. And that's why I see the great magic in what Leo's come up with in his and the people that have been supporting this proposal, which is the magic of being able to focus on one number and everybody sees exactly what's going on. And one last question from Dan.
Actually, I have two totally different proposals, relatively short things. The first is, if the big point in the debate is the one-time wealth tax, could you simply pass a wealth tax, or for that matter, just wipe out all income tax basis and have a constitutional limit against doing it again? That's the kind of the first question. The second one is totally different.
Yeah.
The last time you did generational accounting estimates, which is like 2000, you had a lifetime net tax rate of like 17% for the newborn and 35% for the unborn. Obviously, things have gone wrongly haywire since then. I was just curious what it would look like now, including if you kind of compared the two based on consistent demographic and economic estimates, or you just isolated policy changes.
Yeah, we could have, the first part is, could we have some other kind of a wealth tax? Certainly. I mean, one wealth tax we could have is to have lots of inflation. I think that's coming. We can print lots of money to pay, if we don't have some real reform here, prints lots of money, wipe out the Chinese holding of our debt, and but even that's only going to get us about $5 trillion in present value, not $63 trillion. We have to realize when we think about generational equity here that we've been making massive transfers to the elderly, reducing their tax burden dramatically over the years. And so having a one-time wealth tax on the wealthiest member, on the Leo Lindbecks of the world, is not so inequitable given everything else we've been up to. So I think that we should have a wealth tax as part of a permanent, efficient, equitable system. The second part of your question again was, the generational accounting tax rates. Well, the ratio of the tax rates would be even higher now. The future generations, if we don't get current generations to help pay for the $63 trillion fiscal gap, yeah, we got to put it completely on the next generation. It's going to be at least a doubling of their lifetime tax rate, and if not more. We haven't done any recent calculations on that, but it's bad news. Thank you.